Okay, this will be the last subfield we'll look at on our lightning tour of linguistics. And this is the subfield known as phonetics, which is closely related to phonology, but is distinct from it in some ways. And here's my best attempt to explain the difference between phonetics and phonology. So we just looked at a whole bunch of sound patterns, right? And these involved s and sh and e and other vowels, a, o, a, u. But we weren't actually looking at recordings of these or anything. We were just looking at these stated in terms of abstract symbols, right? This squiggly mark and this other squiggly mark are just visual characters from the International Phonetic Alphabet. There's nothing about these that are inherently related to the sounds involved. And that means that we could have stated all the sound patterns that we looked at uh, in any terms whatsoever that have nothing to do with sound. That's what I mean by abstract here. These are not concrete uh, studies of sounds. They're looking at the non-sound properties of particular categories, and we're just representing those categories with abstract symbols, right? So this is one way of doing it. We could have used any other symbols to describe those patterns, and the patterns would have been exactly the same, right? The only reason that we know the sounds involved is that I happen to be talking over the slides. But really, we could have used A and B to represent these two sounds. We could have used X and Y. We could have used 1 and 2. We could have used this shape and that shape in order to represent these. Really anything. That's what I mean by abstract. The ways that we're representing these categories in stating phonological generalizations is not inherently connected to sound. We're stating them in terms of symbols that have nothing to do with sounds. Right? So that's very phonological. Of course, the patterns in the actual languages we looked at don't involve abstract symbols or mathematical variables, or they don't only involve those things. They involve sounds. Right? So the sounds we were looking at there in particular, I kept telling you, are s and sh. Phonetics studies the sound aspect of sound patterns. What are those sounds like? That's one of the central questions in phonetics, right? Describing how sounds are made, what they sound like, and what their measured properties are like. So here's an example, it's a kind of case study. Again, I'm going to go with Spanish and English here just because that's most of the students in the class, but you can do this kind of work in any language. Interestingly, Spanish and English both have sounds that are described as a tap or flap, and these mean almost the same thing. It's written with this symbol. And what is the sound? Well, in English, sorry, this is really American English, I should have said. This doesn't happen in British English, but in American English, you find this tap sound in between two vowels, where the second of the two vowels is unstressed. That's what this little upside down E is here. It's an unstressed central vowel that's called schwa. Right? So in a word like battle, that middle sound here, while the spelling system of English or your knowledge of British English might lead you to think it's a t sound, that is not how this is generally pronounced in American English. It's not battle, it's battle. So that r sound is a tap or a flap. Similarly, for the word photo, that middle sound there is not a t sound. Right? In photographer, it is a t sound. That's because this vowel would be stressed there. But in photo, in American English, it's a tap sound. So I hope everybody can hear that. The difference would be between photo and photo. In fact, it's hard for me to say that second one without producing a Spanish-like vowel there, because that's really almost ungrammatical in my American English with the T sound in it. Here's another example, word radish, and that's just trying to show you that this is true of sounds that might underlyingly or in the lexicon be represented as t sounds, but also sounds that might be represented in the lexicon as d sounds. And I'm not totally sure about that because in this context, the two sounds are going to come out sounding very similar or maybe even identical. So that's in English, that's where you find the tap or the flap sound. What about Spanish? Well, in Spanish, you can find it in the same kinds of contexts. So in between two vowels, that's a common one. So barato means cheap. And interestingly, a string of phones that I would probably write the same way in these two languages clearly come from two different Latin sources, right? So I'm saying in English that photo comes from the word photo, which I guess is not a Latin source, it's a Greek source. In Spanish, that word would be pronounced foto. And if you put this tap in instead, it changes it to a rhotic sound. So something that would have been an R in Latin, as in photo. Right? Here, this means forum, not photograph. Right? If you want to say photograph in Spanish, you have to produce a voiceless stop, photo. Interestingly, the Spanish one can also appear in other contexts that aren't in between two vowels. So here's an example. It means meadow, and this is going to be pronounced something like prado. So that's kind of interesting. What are taps like? Well, they're often described as ballistic stops, which basically means an extremely short stop consonant, as if they were super, super short versions of t or duh. And that makes sense in English because they clearly correspond to stops in terms of mental representations. If you take a word that ends in a stop, like bat, right, and then you add a suffix to it that puts that relevant t sound in a context where it's in between two vowels with the second one unstressed, it becomes a tap, right? Bat, batter, not batter, unless you're speaking British English. So this is sometimes called an alternation, right? It's showing you that the same sound in the same word takes on two different forms depending on what other sounds are around it. So I think it's safe to say that in American English, these taps are related to stops, t and duh. And this makes sense because you find that their distribution in the phonology is a lot like stops, right? So for instance, in English, you can't have a stop preceding another stop at the beginning of the word. This goes back to our kataf example earlier. So pdo is not a possible word in English. That said, you can have a stop before a sonorant consonant like r. So this is the word pro. So the question here is going to be, hey, does this tap sound or flap sound in English pattern more like a stop or more like a sonorant sound like r? And with regard to the distribution, it looks like it's patterning with the stops. Right? You can't have a stop followed by a tap. You can't have a stop followed by a stop. You can have a stop followed by a sonorant, though, like r. So both the phonetics and the phonology in English seem to suggest to us that basically these taps are kind of a version of stops. In Spanish, however, this is not true at all. They don't pattern like stops at all. Instead, they pattern like a sonorant, like the liquid l sound. What do I mean by that? Well, in Spanish, you can have a stop before a liquid, as in playa, which means beach, but you can't have a stop before another stop at the beginning of a word, as in padaya. That's impossible in Spanish. Right? Playa is fine. What we saw earlier, you can have a stop before one of these taps. So it's unlike English, but it is like liquids or sonorants in Spanish, prado. And of course, this sound is written with an R in Spanish, so probably you already sort of knew this, but writing systems are really not a good source of evidence about a language. You want to look at the spoken language if you're trying to learn something about the mental grammar. And so, yeah, here we're seeing that in English, it looks like taps pattern like stops, but in Spanish, they pattern like liquids. So why is this? Well, maybe phonetics can help us explain. In Spanish, for instance, in between vowels, it's fair to say that these tap sounds, and that's going to be the sound in here, para, which means for, they do look a little bit like short stops. So here's a short stop in the same context, lado. And if you're good at phonetics, you'll be able to tell that this isn't really a stop, but let's ignore that for the moment. Lado means side. So it's my son screaming. And yeah, so what's going on here? Well, in phonetics, we're going to be looking at visual representations of the acoustic energy that's produced when somebody is making sounds, right? So what's happening up here, we have had people utter, in this case, I think it was a Madrileño speaker, somebody from Madrid, utter some Spanish words or sentences into a microphone. and that microphone keeps a record of how air pressure is fluctuating inside it. That air pressure fluctuations are caused by people speaking, and we end up with a record of what a person's speech has done to air pressure down here, as well as a slightly more complicated representation of how energy is distributed over different frequencies throughout time. Up on this top panel, we're looking at the acoustic or physical properties of speech here. And what we're seeing, I mean, you don't need to be able to read one of these spectrograms or the waveform real well. All I'm trying to show you is that this section here, which corresponds to the tap in Spanish, para, looks a little bit like this section here, which corresponds to a stop in Spanish, lado. And yeah, they don't look terribly dissimilar. So this phonetic description that taps kind of look like really short stops doesn't seem to be wrong in Spanish. At least not in between two vowels. When you put the tap in a different position, however, and this is the beginning of the word, I think, prado, which I had printed in the earlier slides, you see that actually they're a little bit more complex than you had realized, right? So this tap sound here still has what I would identify as a very, very short period of kind of stop-like closure. But it's also preceded by this dark part, which is actually like a little bit of vowel in the middle of the sound, right? So what the phonetics is showing us here is that, well, yes, you can kind of think of these Spanish sounds as taps, but they also seem to have some contextual complexity that's not characteristic of taps in languages like English. And so the next step for a phonetically based explanation of these facts would be to try to see whether we can use those differences to explain why English and Spanish grammar work differently with regard to the taps. And I'm going to show you some kind of examples here. You're not going to understand every bit of this because you probably haven't studied phonetics at this level, but the basic idea is that there's going to be a number of ways to think about why things work the way they do in terms of articulation. That's how you move your speech organs in order to create sounds, and in terms of perceptibility, which is what are the properties of speech that your ear and your processing system are attuned to, right? So this is just an example. You don't need to understand exactly what's going on here, but it's a proposal about how the different parts of your vocal anatomy might be moving in a sequence like gra. And here there's, instead of writing this as a tap, there's a little symbol on it that's trying to show that it's really more like an extremely short trill sound. And the details about where these different articulators in your vocal tract are at different points in time are being used here to try to explain why you get that sort of complex vowel-like realization of this allegedly tap sound in some positions in Spanish. You don't need to understand every detail of what's going on in this chart, but it's a way of trying to use the physical mechanisms of speech to explain some kind of mysterious facts about the difference between English and Spanish. Note, everything I've said about Spanish here would also apply to Russian, except for the availability of stop-stop sequences. This is more on the perceptibility side, and again, you don't need to understand every single detail here, except all you should know is that this is a plot of some acoustic measurements of different vowels in Spanish, as well as what that little vowel-like portion of the tap looks like. So we're taking acoustic measurements of all of these, and we're trying to use these acoustic measurements to explain why it might be perfectly okay to have a tap sound appear after a stop in Spanish when it isn't in English. And so these particular acoustic properties are referred to as formants, and you can see them in the spectrograms that I put up earlier, but those details are not important for you to try to get right now. The main point here is just we're appealing to acoustic and hearing properties of the sounds involved to try to explain why they behave the way they do, right? So that's what I would consider to be phonetics. I guess some phoneticians would say that that is partially phonological as well, because we're trying to explain things in phonology with reference to phonetics. But this is what phonetics is fundamentally about, the physical properties of speech sounds. So that is my lightning introduction to linguistics, and I haven't covered every topic in linguistics, but I've covered most of the ones that we'll teach here in the department. There are lots and lots of details here, and lots of principles and cross-linguistic variation, and it's totally fine if you didn't get every single detail, or if there were some things you didn't understand. You're going to be learning about these things during your next 2 years of study. And the point here was just to sort of give you an idea of what these different areas of linguistics are about, rather than to really make sure that you thoroughly learn the specific facts I tried to present here. So that's what I'm calling basic linguistics, but that's really just the beginning of what linguists do, because once we know some basic properties of languages and their speakers, then we can begin to ask all sorts of interesting questions about how those properties function out there in the world. So how do our linguistic abilities and our linguistic knowledge interact with other aspects of the world, right? And this is where all of the kind of hyphenated and applied fields come in. So I wanted to briefly talk about some of these. Even this big Venn diagram with lots of circles is not a complete mapping of all the language-related sciences or fields. It's just partial, but these are some of the common ones, right? And so I've got basic linguistics as this middle circle. And then I'm trying to show that linguistics can overlap with all these other disciplines on the outside here, and that for each one, there's going to be an overlap area where we're doing both. So for instance, if you want to combine linguistics with social science and study the cultural dynamics of language use and change, that's going to be sociolinguistics. We have some excellent classes here in sociolinguistics. Dr. Robles Puente teaches a class in our department, and there's a sociolinguist in the English department named Kirk Hazen, who teaches sociolinguistics classes there that are more specifically geared towards English. Those actually might be a nice option for some of the TESOL students, because they're often also incorporating aspects of the history and structure of English. If you want to combine basic linguistics with psychology, with experimental psychology, what's sometimes called cognitive psychology, you can combine these two areas and you'll end up with psycholinguistics or possibly neurolinguistics. And this is the study not of systems of implicit knowledge in language, but of language use, right? So what are the actual tasks that you do with language, and how are those tasks accomplished? Ideally, you'd want to draw on some knowledge about how people encode languages or what kinds of grammars they have if you're going to be trying to describe linguistic behavior. If you want to combine linguistics with history or archaeology, you'll end up with historical linguistics, right? And this studies basically the history of how languages have changed over time. And it actually also often interacts with the study of human populations, older human populations, because historical linguistic evidence can be used as evidence for the movements of people in ancient time where you might not have good records, right? We don't have a historical linguistics class here, and it doesn't look like there's going to be one anytime in the future. But if this is something that really interests you, let me know and I can try to find you some resources. Oh, I should have said earlier, there is a psycholinguistics class here. It's with Dr. Stepanovich, and it's excellent. I also run a class that's about linguistics as a cognitive science, and that's going to have some relevance to this overlap as well. What about linguistics and biology? Well, I guess neurolinguistics, the study of how language functions in the brain, would be a kind of biological interface, although people study neuroscience in both psychology and in biology. Right? And then there's also questions about how did language evolve, right? Do we have any special adaptations? Do humans have any special biological adaptations for language? If so, when did they arise? What kinds of abilities does it make use of? What are the biological properties of language? And how did it come to be a unique feature of the human species? That topic is notoriously controversial and vexed and very hard to get reliable evidence in, but it nonetheless exists as an area of study. Nobody here studies language evolution, but again, if you're interested, I can show you some things about it. Now, as I said in an earlier presentation, applied linguistics doesn't only refer to language teaching, but that's most of what applied linguistics is. And for sure here, most of the applied linguistics going on is going to be about language teaching. So I'm putting this as the intersection between basic linguistics and education. Right? So if you're interested in seeing how educational techniques and experiments and different kinds of best practices from education can be applied specifically to language classes, you're going to need to know something about the languages. So this is applied linguistics. Related but not totally identical, there's a field called second language acquisition. And it's very similar, except it might not be as explicitly concerned with education. It might just be concerned with people acquiring foreign languages, whether it's in a classroom or somewhere else. That's what second language acquisition is about. Finally here, I've repeatedly referenced linguistic systems here as being information systems, communication systems, systems with mathematical structure and variables. And so you might want to ask, well, how do linguistic systems look as a kind of mathematical or formal system? And computer science is going to be the discipline that looks at the mathematical properties of string systems like that. If you want to combine that aspect of computer science with linguistics, that's referred to as computational linguistics, and it studies the formal mathematical properties of different kinds of linguistic systems. Right? There is not much of a computational linguistics contingent here. I do some myself, but in general, this is a very hard thing to teach to linguists if they don't have a background in computer science, so we don't have any classes in computational linguistics here. Nevertheless, if you have a strong background in math or in computer science or in coding, and you're interested in this, I can certainly talk to you about computational linguistics sometime. So this is sort of a partial map of what goes on in the language sciences and related fields. And yeah, I hope this will help you sort of situate yourself in thinking about what you might want to learn about or what kinds of aspects of linguistics you might be getting into.